Actually, I like that better. Closer up, more personal. Hi, I'm nervous. I'm nervous. Stage fright. Man, have I always had stage fright? Yeah, I have. Just stop. Just talk. Hi, I'm Sarah Maywalt. There are a lot of things that I want to say that I really just don't think there's enough time to deal with in the meetings, and also I can be a little bit, especially in a group setting, I can get kind of by the book, kind of almost too technical, sometimes too argumentative, and I want to spare you from that as much as I can. One of the things I think a lot of discussions like this is lacking is an actual talk of the experiences, like not just in the sport, but the whole life experience of a trans person. And I can't claim to speak for all trans people, but I can speak for me. And I hope that speaking about some of my experiences will be, educational, informative, and might help you get to understand people like me a little better. And I got some cards here. I'm not gonna. I could put up a teleprompter and read something, but I think it's more important for it to be a little bit more organic. So I'd like to start by telling you my first memory related to my gender issues. And the first memory was at preschool. I must have been about 4 or 5, and for some reason at the preschool, somebody decided to introduce the bathroom to me, and they pointed at the urinal, and they called that the boys' toilet, and they pointed at the bowl toilet, the one you have in your house, and they said that's the girls' toilet. Um, and my first memory was being so afraid that somebody would find out that I really felt like I was a girl, that I took a crap in the urinal. Now, I mean, it's a funny story, and I relate it as such, but it's also really sad because the first time I can remember thinking about myself in that way, I was already so terrified that I was willing to go to the embarrassment and humiliation of trying to crap in the urinal just just to keep just to just to prove that I was a guy. And that's really sad when you think about it, that a kid that young has to deal with that. My childhood was not pleasant. My father died just before I was 7. I was bullied. I was harassed. I tried very hard to convince myself that I didn't have a problem. Um, I, 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 and at times it almost seemed like it worked, but the problem was that the feeling never went away. Um, and it was an awful feeling. It was an ache, a dull, throbbing ache right in the pit of my chest, right in the center of my soul. I spent my childhood, you know, utterly depressed. I ate until I was very heavy. Um, it was a feeling that was so lonely and so terrifying, because you're taught that that is one of the worst things that you could feel. But one of the things about that, as I was getting older, I've sort of felt like I was so miserable that, maybe this was just some sort of escapism. Maybe it was just I felt so awful that I wanted to be someone else, and that being a girl was the furthest thing away from me that I could be. Um, and then I went to college, and things got a bit better. I met some friends. I actually found a niche. Um, I had my first love. And that was the moment. That was the moment because I, for the first time, was relatively happy. And that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach was still there. I didn't want to be someone else. I wanted to be me, and I was a girl. I first told my psychiatrist. I had been writing it down in a journal, finally admitting it to myself somewhere for some time. And I said I had to tell somebody because I didn't know the way forward. But as is, my particular MO, I procrastinated as long as I could, even to the point where I was in the last couple minutes of my appointment. And I finally got up the courage to say that I had something to say. But as soon as I went to actually say it, I found the words couldn't come out. And I was stammering and I was crying. And my psychiatrist, she said, "Can you write it down and pass it to me?" And as long as I made that, like I could write it down on a piece of paper, and then I could hand a piece of paper over to her that happened to have those words on it. And the only reason I felt safe telling her was I knew that if she had told anyone else, I could sue her so bad. So after I told my psychiatrist, I told everybody else after a little bit. Now, honestly, that's just the way I do things. I felt like I needed to know where people stood. One of the most awful things for trans people is that their families and friends can turn away from them. People that they care about, people that they've loved for their entire lives can disown them. I had one trans friend who told me that her father told her that he would have rather she had killed somebody than be trans. I was fortunate. Most of my family stayed behind me. Most of my friends stayed behind me. So there were a couple of problem areas, but by and large, I didn't have to deal with that. Getting help for being trans back then, like the 99, 2000, was a lot more difficult. There were very few people who had any experience dealing with trans people. I was at Penn State, which is right in the middle of Pennsylvania, out in the abject farmlands. The closest place to me was Pittsburgh, and I'd take a Greyhound bus down to Pittsburgh and back in one day. That's 5.5 hours each way, just for a 1 hour appointment every other week. At that time, even when you got help, it took a very long time. I was going there for more than 2 years, and then I got the approval to go in front of their council of elders to have them, decide whether or not they'd give me a recommendation to move forward with hormones. The problem was that it took me, by taking about 2 years to get to that point, my whole life had changed. I was out of college and things didn't exactly work well right away. I was barely making any money, and none of the hair removal or even the doctor's appointments or anything like that would be covered by insurance back then. So everything had to come out of pocket, and I was making a bit above minimum wage, and it just wasn't happening. And I panicked, and I had actually even started taking hormones, but I had to back away. It took about 10 more years, 8 to 10 more years for me to actually get up the momentum to transition again. There's a lot of stuff I'm glossing over here. There's just too much stuff. If anybody wants to speak to me and have questions or something like that, I'm totally open to talking about my life. It was a bit better. Admitting it to myself during that time allowed me to at the very least stop trying to be such a guy. And that helped a bit. but it still was awful. One of the things I kept on thinking was, what if I died before I could transition? What if my tombstone read my old name? What if no one knew who I really was? And eventually I moved to New York. I started doing comedy and I got a relatively decent job, and things were going okay. So I started working towards it. It was a lot easier in, say, 2008, 2009 to get help, especially in some place like New York City. But there was still a lot of fear. And the anxiety was so much, I went to my psychiatrist at the time, and they prescribed uh, Xanax. I was on Xanax. And this was right in the middle. Like, my goal was to get everything ready for one moment. I wanted to make the change as quickly as possible. I wanted to get all pots to a boil at the same time. But all that, took its toll on me. And then I started taking the Xanax, and unfortunately, the Xanax did not go well with me. It actually made me more anxious. And one of the horrible things, if you're ever taking a medicine like that, if you're ever taking an anti-anxiety medicine and it makes you more anxious, what you'll think is that, oh my God, things are just getting that much worse. And what would happen if I stopped? How anxious would I be then? And the worst part was my muscles just started tightening up, and I felt like my whole body was cramping at a time. And one thing is if you're taking hormones, if you're taking estrogen, one of the things that can happen is you can get blood clots, and those blood clots, they feel like cramps. And so here I'm worried that my whole body is filling full of blood clots. And then I started thinking about, what would that mean? I'd have to stop taking the hormones. I'd have to stop taking the hormones, and I'd have to, and what I would do if that happened. And the answer was not bright and cheerful. I didn't know if I could go on. Fortunately, I had forgotten to take my medicine one day. And around about noon, all my muscles just released. And the anxiety went down to normal, pre-normal anxiety levels. And I realized what happened. But that was an important moment, because I was trying to push to get to transitioning, and I procrastinate as I always do. It was supposed to be at the first of the year, 2010, and then I'm like, well, I'll push it back to my birthday, April 13th. But once that happened, I realized how important it was to me, and how desperate I was inside to do it, regardless of the consequences. So on April 13th, 2010, my 32nd birthday, I transitioned. And I haven't once thought about going back. But the thing is that wasn't the end. That's not the end of the story. That's just the end of the beginning of the story. But while that feeling in the pit of me is better, it's been replaced with all of the animosity, the fear of the animosity of other people, the fear of lack of acceptance for who I am. And that was more than hypothetical. I lost my job because I was trans, even in New York City, which had laws against discrimination. Just as long as you don't say it, you're fine. There were people who were laughing, who'd call me, faggot. Hell, sometimes sticking their head out of their car to do so. People loudly discussing how people like me are probably some sort of like predator. I've had I had people spit at me. I had people threaten me with violence. And even to this day, it's hard to accept myself for who I am. If you've heard of something like imposter syndrome, it's that. But it's not at my job. It's not something else I do. It's every moment of every day. I feel like I'm some sort of imposter. And it's horrible. It's better than the alternative. But I'm not going to tell you it's good. So many trans people that I know have a story about suicide. I remember one talking about before she transitioned, she sat one night with a bottle of pills and she decided against the pills. You know, we have a saying in our country, freedom isn't free. And usually they're talking about the military or something like that, but it's just true regardless. I've had to make a lot of sacrifices just to be myself. And I never asked for this. I never wanted it. It sucks. I wish every single day of my life that I had not been born trans, but I have been. I see every day these people trying to take our lives away from us, to take our identities away from us. You know, saying we can't use the toilet for our gender, saying that we can't go to the doctor to get medical care, saying we can't play on our sports teams. And the thing is, like, I live in a liberal state in the US, and it's not happening here, but every time I hear about it, it hurts me. Every time it makes me feel like less of a human being. Every time I hear it, it makes me so lonely and so sad. And the worst part is that there's no reason for it. I've done nothing to hurt anybody. Trans people aren't cheating. And hell, even the medical evidence shows that there's not some runaway advantage that trans women are getting. But still, you know, World Athletics are banning us. And the funny thing is, I don't even care about track and field. I find it boring. I don't like it. But it still hurts. If World Curling were to shut the door completely, of course there has to be rules, but if World Curling were to shut the door completely, I really don't know if I could continue curling. Even if I'd never actually had the opportunity. I mean, I have dumb dreams. I have this dumb dreams. I wish I could qualify for real nationals. I just would like to. I know I'm never going to make it. I'm too old. I'm too big. My balance sucks. But there's not that many women's teams competing. And because of that, the bar is not that high in the US. And I'd like to give it a go. I'd like to just give it a go. I don't know how I could continue playing knowing that despite no real reason to keep us away, that sport turned their back on us. And I love this sport so much. So when we talk about fairness, I think it's important to talk about the entirety of it. We don't deserve to feel like this. We don't deserve to have to prove that we belong. I don't see why we have to be excluded. Thanks for listening.